Again, a constructor, we know it is used to construct an instance of an object of a class, or an instance of a class is an object. So unlike the properties and methods, a superclass constructors are not inherited in this subclass. Okay, so we know that only the methods that are those are public that can be inherited, right? But not the constructor itself. Now they can only be invoked from the subclasses constructors. If you want to invoke the constructor of the superclass, you have to invoke through the subclass constructors. By using the keyword super, we're going to see an example. If the keyword super is not explicitly used, the superclass no-args constructor is automatically invoked. An example, superclass constructors is always invoked. A constructor may invoke an overloaded constructor or its superclass constructor. If none of them is invoked explicitly, the compiler puts super at the first statement. So this is implicitly invoked in a constructor. Like for example, if I define public A, like you always do that, compiler is always called super of the object class, because object class is the, if you remember, the parents, right, of all the Java classes. But you never have to say super. So this is another constructor which has the parameters. It's pretty much the same thing. It's always called super, even you're not defining it. This is called implicitly invoked. Now, if you want to use the keyword super to refer to a superclass of a class in which super appears, this keyword can be used in two ways. To call a superclass constructor or to call a superclass method. Alright, let's look at an example. Alright, you must use the keyword super to call the superclass constructor. Invoking a superclass constructor name in a subclass causes a syntax error. You can't just say the superclass name like animal inside the dog constructor. Inside the dog constructor, you have to say super to invoke the animal constructor. Otherwise, it's going to be a syntax error. Java requires that the statement that uses the keyword super appear first in the constructor. Also, when you want to use the super keyword, it had to be first in the first line inside the constructor of the child. Okay, this is an example. We want to constructing an instance of a class to invoke all the superclasses constructor along the inheritance chain. So we said faculty extends employee, and this is the main called new faculty. And faculty itself has the constructor named faculty, which is going to print faculty is no args, right? Constructor is invoked. And we said employee extends from person. And we have the constructor for employee. And we talk about this reference. You can use this to call the constructor with the parameters. right, and pass the parameter in with invoke employees overloaded constructor. This is called overloaded constructors, which is pass in parameters here and print s, and at the bottom is print no args constructor is invoked. Now let's look at person. Person call the constructor, create a constructor person, which say person no args constructor is invoked. Now we see that the super is actually implicitly invoked because we never define super here. Alright. When it's implicitly invoked, it's called the constructor with no args. Okay, with no arguments. So once we run this program, let's trace the code. Start from the main method. We call the constructor of faculty. Remember, it should not print this line because they implicitly call the constructor of employee. So that's why this one we label as 4. It will never print out yet. Right? It's because super is implicitly invoked first. So that's why it has to jump to employee. And employee faculty is going to invoke the constructor, which is implicitly mean the default construct with no args. So this has to be invoked first. And this, when it's invoked, is also invoked with super of person first. So that's why I had to jump to person. And super of person that we invoke is the one with no args, which is this one. That's why this is going to print out first. That's why we label number 1. After this print out, then it starts to do the this, which is called the overloaded constructor of employee, that call and print this number 2. And it's print its own employee no args number 3. And then once it's done, it's come back and print that number 4, faculty. The impact of a superclass without the no args constructors. So this could be an example that you have on the test. Like, I'm going to say public class apple extends fruit. Class fruit call the constructor, but this fruit doesn't have no args constructor, only fruit string name with the args constructor, and print fruits constructor is invoked. Alright, so let's look at an errors when you don't define the default constructor in fruit with no args. The error is when apple try to inherit it from fruit. So we use extends keyword when we want to do inheritance from the parent class fruit. The problem is you are not able to do that because there's no default constructor, which is the constructor without the arguments defined in fruit. Remember, if I have no constructor with the arguments, then it should be okay, because by default compiler will generate the default constructor for fruit for you, which is no args constructor. Then apple can extend from fruit. But once you define a constructor with parameters, you are required to define the constructor with no arguments. Otherwise, when you may say, hey, I don't need it. Of course you don't need it. That means this class can no longer be inherited. Because once we inherit it, there's going to be an error. So that's why always create the no arcs constructor to use or for other classes, because you don't want that errors to happen when another class try to inherit from the class that you created. So always have the no arcs constructor like that. And when you define like that, it's implicitly called super, which you can do explicit like that too. This is going to be exactly the same thing, which with or without super keyword. It's going to do it implicitly anyway. But normally we're going to define super if we actually want to refer to the parents. Like for example, I have the parent fruit. I want to refer to the arc super with the arcs constructor of the super with the arcs. Like now I want to say apple, and if I don't define super, it's implicitly referred to fruit, right, constructor. But if I don't want to refer to that, I actually can just say, I can't say fruit. This is going to be an error. You can't define the constructor name. You have to refer to super and say apple constructor. That's how you explicitly define it, and super is lowercase s. Alright, so we have apples and fruit. Now, if you want to instantiate an object of apple, Washington equals to new apple. Alright, so if we want to print out to see, this will invoke toString method of, they all have toString because they inherit from object. Correct? Now we are required to write how you want toString to show, right? Otherwise we cannot test the code. So string, and you can look at override. Override is just to make sure you actually overriding the toString method of the object, which is your super class. Return I'm going to return, I don't have any attributes, so I don't actually need to prove this. Just do system.out instead then, to make it easy inside. Apple constructor with no ARGS, right? And this is going to be fruits constructor with no ARGS. Fruit constructors with ARGS. Yeah. Arguments. Then I don't need to do this. I just want to prove that. Don't have to worry about toString. Run main. In this case, when we run the application, we instantiate an object of apple named Washington. Look at the apple constructors. The super, which is invoke the constructor of fruit with the arguments that being invoked first, passing in, and that means the fruits constructor with args has to print out first.